Welcome back. My first guest, is always, leading off our show, is the great Luke Jones from parts unknown. He's way up there in the far north or far south PA region. That's as much information as we're going to give about Luke. But Luke, welcome in.
Dennis, how are you, my friend? It's good to talk to you.
Always good to talk to you. And more of the same, right, Luke? We have the combine, we have press conferences, but it just feels like it's more of the same until something actually happens. A lot of lip service from all the talking heads.
Yeah, you just said it. I mean, we just celebrated Groundhog Day about a month ago. Well, not celebrate, but observed it, I guess. I don't really care one way or the other, but it really has that feel of Eric DeCosta saying what he said. He's still optimistic. He did mention that he and Lamar met recently. Now, was that in person? Was that via Zoom? I can recall a quote that I chuckled at about a year ago when DeCosta said that he and John Harbaugh had spent some time with Lamar Jackson on the phone via text, which I just thought was one of the funniest quotes I've heard, which kind of maybe doesn't sum up this negotiation, but does reflect how unorthodox it's all been. But did not get the sense that a deal was imminent by any stretch of the imagination, which was not a surprise based on all the conjecture, based on all the reporting that's out there, whether it's true, untrue, or somewhere in between, where there's some half truths to what's being said. But the one thing that we do know is there is going to be something that's coming very soon, and it is the franchise tag deadline. It's going to be on Tuesday. Barring a major compromise, a major amount of movement toward a long-term contract that I don't think anyone foresees over the next few days at the very least, there is going to be a franchise tag placed on Lamar Jackson. And once we see which tag he gets, whether it's the exclusive, which is projected, it's not a set amount right now, but would be projected to be around $45 million, or the non-exclusive, which is $32.4 million, that will at least give us our next checkpoint in terms of trying to contextualize this offseason in terms of what the Ravens are going to do. Because, yeah, you can look at it and say, okay, $32.4 million is cheaper, and it is. It does make other roster maneuvering more possible, but at the same time, we also know that the Ravens have to make some moves just to comply with the cap, let alone get yourself in a position where you can make an addition or two or things of that nature. So, and one thing that Eric DeCosta said in Indianapolis this week, what he flat out acknowledged that they're kind of in a holding pattern with their roster building, and you kind of have to be, because let's face it. I mean, let's put the cap aside for a moment, Dennis. If you are in fact going to trade Lamar Jackson, and I don't think the Ravens know that, because I don't think that's something you can know right now until all the puzzle pieces start to fit together. And we've talked about the lack of an agent. We've talked about the fact that, is there going to be a team that, one, meets Lamar's contract demands, and two, meets the Ravens asking price for a trade? I think they're gathering information. They're in the midst of potentially doing that, but they're still, I think everything is still on the table, regardless of how you want to place the odds right now. But come back to that roster. If in fact it comes down to the Ravens ultimately trading Lamar Jackson, and I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but it's certainly a non-zero chance of that. I think even the most optimistic fans at this point have to acknowledge that. If you're trading Lamar Jackson, does it make sense to bring Calais Campbell back for one more year? Or does it make more sense to let him go and go to a team that, let's face it, in 2023, is going to have a better chance to win a Super Bowl? Even if the Ravens trade up and they draft Bryce Young, or they draft C.J. Stroud, or they love Will Levis, or Anthony Richardson's the next Lamar Jackson, you're certainly not going to make the Ravens a Super Bowl favorite if Lamar Jackson's not their quarterback in 2023. So that right there steers, at least in my opinion, what you're going to do from a roster building standpoint. And that doesn't mean I think you necessarily tank either, but I think you're realistic about where you stand with some of these veteran players. So I just gave you one example. We can go down the list of guys that are free agents, Marcus Peters, Justin Houston, guys that, have cap numbers that you'd like to adjust. So, it's just an example of why right now it kind of feels like talking about anything else on this football team It's almost something you're doing in vain, because until you have an idea of what, one, is Lamar Jackson going to be here in 2023, and two, what amount of money he's going to be taking up on your cap, it impacts what you're going to try to do with the rest of your roster dramatically. So that's where, we can talk about Marcus Peters, we could talk about, some wide receivers, we could talk about the corners in this draft. And look, the Ravens are going to make draft picks regardless, so it's not as though they won't make any additions. But until we get a little more clarity, and we'll start to get a little more coming, this coming week, it really is difficult to try to make heads or tails of exactly what this roster is going to look like moving forward.
No question about it, Luke. And the other piece, and of course, hindsight's 2020. Wish we could have seen Lamar Jackson in a different scheme a year ago. But then again, Greg Roman, 2 years left on his contract at that point. I don't know if that even ever factored into the equation, but I do believe the Ravens are going to put the exclusive tag on him. And hopefully he shows up just to see what they have in the new offense, because it's a gamble for them, but it's also a gamble for Lamar Jackson. If, let's say, they get him a couple of wide receivers, they trade for one and they draft one and they hit on him and they open up the offense, and the players are good, but he doesn't take the next step, he's going to cost himself significant money. So that's the risk he takes. For the Ravens, it's diminished value on the player. Something that we should have seen by now, but we haven't. And there's only really one quarterback, in my opinion, that can elevate an offense, and that's Patrick Mahomes. I think everybody else needs pieces. Patrick he can make you and I look good. He can put the ball right in our breadbasket. But with Lamar, I do see an exclusive tag on him, and they'll listen. And if they get some spectacular offers, and they'll move forward. But I watched Eric DeCosta's press conference twice, and the word he used was wrench. Right there's a wrench in their plans, and there has to be, right? How could it not? And you just talked about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just there. And so much of what's said at the combine every year, you kind of let it go in one ear and out the other, right? I mean, we know that there have been players that the Ravens have talked about in terms of these glowing terms that, they're in our plans, and then 3 weeks later they're not on the roster anymore, right? And on the flip side, things can appear really dire, and then you work something out. And DeCosta even alluded to that. And I'll remind everyone, as I wrote at BaltimorePositive.com Wednesday, talking March 1st, when DeCosta spoke at the combine, that was the 10-year anniversary of the Ravens striking a deal with Joe Flacco, which had been a month after the Super Bowl. And as much as over time we kind of think of, oh, that was such a peachy time and everything. No, it wasn't. There was, the Ravens certainly weren't fond of Joe Linta, Flacco's agent, and the extraordinary amount of leverage that they had. And keep in mind, Joe Flacco, when he had his press conference for his extension, it was done in the media room. This was not a formal thing where Ozzie Newsome and John Harbaugh were, flanking him and they had their arms around him and everything. Yeah, the Ravens were happy to get the deal done, but they also knew how much money they had to give him. And look, Flacco bet on himself, and he won big time. And that's why, as I wrote in my most recent 12 Ravens thoughts, so what makes this so difficult is Lamar Jackson was MVP 4 years ago, right? And you just alluded to the fact that their offense, and this is not at all solely on Lamar Jackson by any stretch, because as you alluded to, the offensive coordinator who orchestrated that offense isn't even here anymore. We could talk about injuries. We could talk about wide receiver missteps. We can talk about the offensive line play a couple years ago and how it really fell off. But the reality is, Lamar Jackson's peak performance, the Ravens' peak performance in the Lamar Jackson era, was a few years ago. So you have that factor. You have the factor of Lamar having not finished each of the last 2 seasons. And that's where I look at this thing and say, yeah, if I'm the Ravens, those factors, those realities don't at all disqualify my thinking of giving him a conventional, lucrative, long-term contract. But it does discourage me from just saying, oh, yeah, I'm going to follow the same step that the Cleveland Browns took, an organization that is known for being dumb, for lack of a better term, lack of a more sophisticated term to describe it.
Hey, but Luke, you think they're regretting the contract right now? I mean, there's rumors out there that they already are asking Deshawn Watson to restructure, right? Because that $55 million per year, what is it for the next 4 years? That is a big number to swallow, right? And a big number to work through as your attempts to build a roster around that. It's almost impossible.
Well, I mean, I don't know if they're regretting it yet, but I feel like they're going to start regretting that much sooner rather than later if he doesn't play much more like the, say, 2019 Deshaun Watson in Houston. If he looks like the guy that he looked like at the end of last season, and I get it, putting aside personal feelings about him off the field, he hadn't played football in about 2 years. So, okay, fine. But yeah, your point is well taken. And that's where you just look at this thing. And to go back to the point you had made about Lamar Jackson, and let's right now work under the assumption that there isn't a trade. Either the Ravens don't want to trade him, or they don't get an offer that's sufficient. And I've kind of scrimmaged back and forth with Nestor about this, where he's of the opinion that the Ravens are much more in a position of feeling like they're done with Lamar and frustrated, where as I think there's certainly frustration. I think there's frustration on both sides, but I don't think you're just ready to give up that asset without really making sure you're maximizing it. You're talking about a special talent, and we've seen that. So the question then becomes, if you're not trading him and you're not getting a long-term deal done, how do you navigate this 2023 season with him playing on the tag? We've already mentioned the challenges from a roster building standpoint, but as you alluded to, Lamar still has plenty of skin in the game. That starts with, if it's the exclusive tag, it's going to be around $45 million. Is he going to leave that? One, is he going to leave that on the table, as some have at least just wondered if he would do the Le'Veon Bell thing, which I would say there's a very, very, very small chance of that happening. I wouldn't say it's impossible, I suppose, because there's so much about this that we thought was impossible, and then 2 years later, here we are.
Sure.
But there's that factor.
You and I would not advise him to leave $45 million on the table. Now, we'd advise him maybe to skip camp, whatever you want to do, to lessen the chance of injury. But he's still a year older, just like Le'Veon Bell was a year older after skipping the season, and it didn't work out well for him. So that's a cautionary tale for the Lamar Jackson camp.
No question. And let's be clear. I think this is going to fall somewhere on the scale of that extreme, which is Lamar sitting out, which I don't think he's going to sit out the whole season. I'd be shocked by that. That $45 million is way more than his total career earnings at this point in time. So you have that factor. On the flip side, I don't think this is as simple and hunky-dory as he signs the tag and then he's there for the entire offseason and training camp. I think it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be as simple as last year where he skipped voluntary OTAs.
Yeah.
To me, as I said all along, for me, that was a symptom more so than a major concern that he just wasn't there. It was a symptom, though, that there clearly was some frustration because he had shown up each of the previous years. So I think it's going to be more than that. I think it's because, for one thing, until he signs that tag, he's under no contractual obligation to show up for mandatory minicamp. He's under no contractual obligation to show up for training camp. But as you astutely pointed out, and I do agree, he still is in a position where he wants to continue to keep his value as high as possible. So, and that includes needing to learn a new offense. And as you mentioned, you hope the Ravens can figure out a way to, whether it's drafting a wide receiver in the first round, someone like Zay Flowers, who, looks like someone that I would like to have on my football team, one of those wide receivers we've talked about in the first round, whether it's a trade, whether it's a combination of both things. You want to be able to build that rapport. You want to learn Todd Monken's offense. Now, does that mean he shows up for the first day of training camp? I think that's very difficult to say. Does that mean he shows up on August 15th and he still gives himself about 3 weeks to get ready? And, let's face it, behind the scenes, behind closed doors, there's a way to get him, even if he's not under contract, he hasn't signed the tag, there are ways to get him intel about the offense and for him to do what he needs to do to at least not be too behind.
Sure,
I'd say. But yeah,
and Todd Monken talked about it. He said, look, it's still football. Even if he misses whatever,
sure,
it's not rocket science. And also, I would think with Monken's presence on the team now, not a stretch that a Stetson Bennett doesn't make his way on the roster, whether it's via free agency or depending on his combine performance via the NFL draft, because he'll know the offense. That's one thing. Not saying he'll be a pro quarterback by any stretch, but at least Monken will have a guy that can come in there and run his offense.
No question. And I mean, I think even if everything's hunky dory, even if they strike a deal with Lamar tomorrow,
You still get
You would think
you still
Stetson
get
Bennett's
Bennett
probably going to be, and
yeah, he's going to be
I mean, he's projected to be a day 3 pick. I mean,
he
we'll
is.
see how all that works out, but we're not talking about someone who's a specimen who's going to be drafted
No,
early.
no, but
Right.
again, as a
But he could be
backup
your backup quarterback is the point. Right.
in the system for sure.
Sure, in the same way that the Ravens took a flyer on Trace McSorley a few years ago. You
100%.
could absolutely see something like that. But yeah, I mean, that's why I've said all along, I know it makes for bad radio when we don't speak in these absolutes that get headlines and clicks and gets views on YouTube videos and things of that nature. But this is just such a delicate, complicated negotiation, and it has been all along. And my goodness, I was talking with someone, someone that's plugged in, someone who's around the team. I was talking to them recently, and I made mention of, when you think about all of the fatigue that we've talked about from a fan standpoint, from a media standpoint, of talking about Lamar's contract, talking about this saga, can you imagine? And I don't say this to make any apologies for Eric DeCosta and the Ravens, because I will point out, in fairness, we can talk as much as we want about the Deshaun Watson deal. Let's also keep in mind, if we're going to be fair and objective here, Lamar Jackson was eligible for a contract extension more than a year before that deal was signed and consummated. So did the Ravens handle things well? Did they misstep at some point, and that caused contract talks to break down? I'm just speculating. I'm just saying. But I will say this in defense of Eric DeCosta: we've all talked about the amount of fatigue that's been involved here, negotiating with a player, not an agent, with a player. And I'm not even saying this to pick on Lamar Jackson as an individual. I think this would be the case with any player, going back and forth, and it's off and on. We know it hasn't been 2 straight years of negotiating, because we know there have been significant stretches of time where they haven't even spoken about the contract. But can you imagine how exhausting that would have to be? Sure. Knowing how carefully you have to choose your words. You and I just laid out some of the things that you're concerned about with Lamar Jackson, in a big picture sense. I mean, there's a very fair argument, and this does not mean that I don't think Lamar Jackson is a very good quarterback still, today, presently, and moving forward. But there is a fair argument to be made that, compared to what he was as a 22-year-old unanimous league MVP, or I guess 21, I guess he was at that point in time, 21, 22 years old, compared to 26, which is not a dinosaur, let's be clear. But there is an argument, if you're being skeptical, if you're making the argument against a fully guaranteed contract, there is an argument to be made that Lamar Jackson is a depreciating asset. Now, if we want to be very literal about that, we're all depreciating assets, right? In life and in football. And that's just the truth. No one lives forever, right? So, I'm being a little facetious here, but my point is acknowledging that reality, even though that sounds a little harsh, and I don't mean it to sound harsh. I already said Lamar Jackson's a hell of a quarterback, but these are the types of arguments you're making in a negotiation. And normally that's filtered through an agent, but you don't have that luxury in this situation. And people have said, well, Lamar Jackson's, his mom or the NFLPA, he's in the negotiation because it's not it's not a certified agent. So that's where you look at this thing and just say, boy, there has to be a lot of fatigue there. And look, Eric DeCosta makes the big bucks, so I'm not saying I lose sleep for him at night, but it does speak to just how exhausting this entire process has been, and how much you'd like to have a resolution one way or the other. But at the same time, I would also say, just because we're getting to the franchise tag deadline, that doesn't mean that we're getting a true resolution. It just means we're going to get a little more context as far as how the Ravens are going to try to proceed in the meantime. Because at the same time, if you're Lamar Jackson, you're trying to, if you're still, your heels are still dug in on getting a fully guaranteed deal, guess who else is up for an extension this offseason? Joe Burrow, Jalen Hurts, Justin Herbert. And on the flip side, those 3 individuals, and I get it, the organizations they play for, the ownership for which those teams play, you would not anticipate a fully guaranteed deal. However, very well, their agents are all paying close attention to what happens with Lamar Jackson. So it gets into the same waiting game that we've been talking about, that if one of those, if the Ravens suddenly said, Lamar, we'll give you a fully guaranteed deal, then that it changes. And now it's not an outlier of one with Deshaun Watson. It's now Deshaun Watson and Lamar Jackson each in the last year. So it changes everything. So the point I'm making, and I know I'm a little all over the place here because my goodness, there's so much to talk about with this. But the point I'm making here is we still might be in for a long wait still as far as this thing working out. And that is not ideal in terms of trying to figure out and construct your 2023 football team, but it's reality right now. And until we see some significant movement in one fashion or another, I'm not so sure we're going to be, sitting here and saying that there's going to be a clear resolution. Although certainly it would benefit the Ravens to have that at least by the start of the new league year in a couple of weeks, because we know, one, they're going to have to be compliant with the salary cap, but two, that's when free agents are available, and you can sign Lamar to an extension 3 months from now, and that'll be great for the long term, of course, but it would really put you in a bind in terms of what you're trying to do to make yourself a more viable Super Bowl contender this year. So it's just, there's so many options on the table right now, Dennis, and I would say it's fascinating if it weren't for the fact that we've been talking about it so long at this point in time that I think we're all looking for a resolution, but I'm just not sure that that resolution is going to be imminent necessarily.
See, it's a shame that Lamar Jackson isn't fourth in line versus first in line, because the three organizations you just mentioned, the Bengals, the Eagles, and the Chargers, those owners, they're not. I mean, they're rich, but they're not filthy rich, because when you got to put that money aside, it's cash out of the bank. And the Spanos family, not known for being big spenders. Jeffrey Lurie, not known for being a big spender, and of course Mike Brown, he's the reason why the NFLPA negotiated that the owners have to spend up to a minimum of 90% of their cap money, because he was notoriously cheap. So good luck with Burrow and Hurts and Herbert getting a fully guaranteed deal by those owners. So that's my point with that. And also, I'm going to probably put this out there: hold the line versus hold out. So Steve Bisciotti, he's representing the owners. He wants to hold the line, whereas the NFLPA has made it clear. DeMaurice Smith has come out publicly and said this is a pivotal point in NFL history when it comes to contracts, which is why he's pushing for a bookend deal for Lamar Jackson to get paid that guaranteed money to set that precedent going forward for the players.
No question. And Dennis, what you just laid out, and I kind of gave the other side of it in terms of Lamar. You just laid out an argument for the Ravens to sit back and say, you know what?
Absolutely.
This may not be great for our 2023 chances, but 100%. What you just laid out, it could lead us to, if we want to keep Lamar Jackson the quarterback long term.
Because you have three cash poor owners that have to pay their quarterbacks. You don't have who was it, Eddie DeBartolo Jr., who that back when the Niners were winning championships and he was flying in first class and had pink hotel. He just had stupid money. These three owners, Luke, don't have stupid money. They just don't. They don't have Jeff Bezos kind of money.
Yeah, and let's face it. It's one thing to talk about a 30-something Russell Wilson. It's one thing to talk about Kyler Murray. These quarterbacks are quite relevant in stacking up with Lamar Jackson. Joe Burrow, I mean, he's had more success than Lamar Jackson, especially if we want to talk over the last 2 years. Jalen Hurts, I mean, he was on his way to potentially being MVP before getting hurt, and he's gotten to a Super Bowl. Herbert, a little more of a debate there, but certainly his raw talent, people have gushed over. So the point would be, if you're the Ravens and you're not interested in trading Lamar, or you don't get a deal that blows you away, you wait this out, and one or two of those dominoes fall. At that point, then I think Lamar Jackson's argument is dead in the water, short of just then he just digs in principle and says, all right, I'll go the Kirk Cousins route. And then we're talking about something different.
Or if he doesn't want to play for the Ravens, that's the other piece of it. If he just
question.
If he wants a change, that's
right.
him.
And that's where, we've talked about this going back to the end of last season with the injury and all that. I mean, I do really wonder. And look, the Ravens have said all the right things. It's not as though Lamar has come out and bashed the organization or anything like that. So I want to make sure that's a two-way street there. But I do wonder behind the scenes where the frustration level truly lies, where the trust level truly lies. And that's where you do look at this. But from a negotiating standpoint, if Joe Burrow takes a non-guaranteed deal, if Jalen Hurts takes a non-guaranteed deal, then if you're Lamar, you can't you can no longer make the argument that, well, Kyler Murray's not me.
Right.
Russell Wilson's much older than me. So I still look at the Watson deal. Then the Watson deal truly is an outlier. To me, there's really no
Absolutely.
argument to be made anymore at that point. And again, that's where it just comes down to, do you want to be here or not? Or are you just dead set on going to market and being completely free? And hey, in fairness, and this is something that we should bring up a little more often, even though it was several years ago at this point, it is what Kirk Cousins did. And now his fully guaranteed deal was a 3-year deal. So you kind of looked at it in terms of, the full guarantee he got was about what players would get from a full guarantee for a 5 or 6 year deal. He just got it in 3. But he did that, and he stood his ground with Washington, and he got that with the Vikings. So short of Lamar doing that, then one or two of these other quarterbacks signed non-guaranteed deals this offseason. I think his argument and the NFLPA's argument is dead in the water, at least for now. So that's where you look at this thing. And again, that's why I think it's real easy to want, and probably more so to hope, that there's a resolution over the next couple weeks, by the start of free agency, because of what that means for the Ravens from a roster building standpoint, one way or the other. Let's also include the fact that if they get a long-term deal done with Lamar Jackson, it would lower his cap figure for 2023 if it's a more conventional deal that the Ravens are seeking. But we just laid out, if you're the Ravens still playing the long game here with your franchise quarterback, there's absolutely an argument to wait this out, even if it's going to cost you a little bit in 2023. And, a couple of those dominoes fall. To me, Lamar's argument, short of just, I don't want to be here anymore. And I don't know if that's the case or not. I don't think Lamar dislikes Baltimore by any stretch. I think he wants to be here. He just wants to be here on the contract that he wants, which is completely his prerogative, to be very clear.
It is.
But again, does that align with what's going to be what's best for the organization in trying to win long term? That's where there's certainly more debate here. And I'll say it again. I've said it with Nestor. I've said it to you before. What makes this so difficult? You strip away all the details. Let's talk about the offensive coordinator search and this detail, that detail. It's very simple. The Ravens and Lamar Jackson are both coming from making a fair argument. Lamar Jackson's argument is Deshaun Watson got a fully guaranteed deal less than a year ago. I am better than him on the field. I am a better character off the field, stating the obvious. So I feel that I'm entitled to at least that much. Now, again, we can debate the other elements of that, but that's true, right? That's true. I mean, that is a fair, reasonable argument, even if you disagree with it. It's fair. On the flip side, the Baltimore Ravens say, Lamar, we love you, but we aren't taking our cues from the Cleveland Browns, who are an absolutely horrendous organization, and we see what damage that's going to do to their long-term chances, and we're not going to follow those cues. And if you want to know further reasons why, well, your best season was 4 years ago, and you've been injured each of the last 2 years. That doesn't mean we don't want to pay you in the more conventional way of, making you giving you the second highest full guarantee and all those different things. But, we're not going to take our cues from the Cleveland Browns. That is a fair and reasonable argument. So, hence, we have an impasse. We have a stalemate that has been there for a long time now, and doesn't necessarily appear that there's a clear end in sight, in terms of the negotiating part of it. So
Let me ask you a question, Luke. So the Ravens have been quiet. They've been consistent. Their message has been the same. Oh, and the message from the Lamar camp has been inconsistent. It's been out there. They've been more verbal. Stephen A. Smith from ESPN said that somebody talked to him from the Ravens camp and said it's false that Lamar Jackson has asked for a fully guaranteed deal. Now, is two things here. If I want to ask you, is that Lamar's camp sending a message to the Ravens that yes, they'll come off the guarantee money he wants? And the second piece is, if Lamar Jackson asks for a $300 million contract with $250 guaranteed, it's not a fully guaranteed deal, but it's still more than Deshaun Watson. So it could also be a play on words. That's how I took that. Is it A or B? What's going on here?
I think it's much more B. I don't know that for certain, because
that's what I
has been that tight-lipped. But yeah, I think there's And when you look at a scenario like that, and just doing the math off the top of my head, I won't get this right, but to put it in simplistic terms, I feel like if you wanted to structure a deal that way, and yeah, give him a greater full guarantee, then the total money, the total years would start looking much more like a Patrick Mahomes kind of contract, except it would just have way more fully guaranteed money in it, which I don't know, would that be better in the sense of if you're the Ravens, you're still taking a huge risk in terms of the full guarantee that would have ramifications for at a minimum 4 years, if not 5 years. But you could make the argument then that, okay, maybe a 31-year-old Lamar Jackson ages more gracefully than many of us think. And then there would be some team flexibility there. But we also know how these things typically work. A player typically is going to want more money at that point in time. So yeah, I think that was much more a case of semantics because you already cited his name earlier in our conversation. DeMaurice Smith was on a podcast about a month ago, flat out talking about Lamar Jackson, the potential of that being the bookend with Deshaun
100%.
Watson to change the game. And look, in a big picture sense, Dennis, I'm not at all opposed to players getting fully guaranteed contracts. At the end of the day, if you're talking about fundamental change, NFL, football players compared to baseball or basketball, where you look at the physical risk, with their brains, with the long-term debilitating injuries and medical conditions that these guys so often have, I'm fine. I encourage making moves to make that fully guaranteed. But that is a fundamental big picture question rather than a Baltimore Ravens 2023 through 2027 question. So from that standpoint, that's where I fully understand where the Ravens are coming from. On the flip side, I fully understand where Lamar Jackson is coming from. As I feel in looking at it, trying to look at it as logically as possible, Lamar Jackson is not, especially in 2023, if he were the reigning MVP or he just led the Ravens to the Super Bowl, we wouldn't even be talking about this. He would have gotten his fully guaranteed deal because I just think that's how it would have worked in the way that Joe Flacco became the highest paid quarterback in the NFL in 2013, even though he was never the best quarterback in the NFL. He was the best for 3 or 4 weeks that January and February, and God bless him. We're still talking about it because, it was that special. But if you're asking me to look at this logically, that's where I look at this thing and say, I side with the Ravens here. Now, doesn't mean the Ravens couldn't give him a bigger bump in guaranteed money than what they're currently offering, some compromise. But and Eric DeCosta alluded to this, and if you wanted to interpret his words and read between the lines, he talked a lot about it takes two sides. It talks a lot about both sides negotiating in good faith. And he didn't accuse Lamar, but the way that he said it, you could certainly say that it could be a veiled reference to maybe feeling like, hey, we're trying to compromise here. We're trying to give. Whereas it sounds like Lamar Jackson is more of the mind of, give me the Deshaun Watson deal plus, a little bit, or we have nothing to talk about. And look, at the end of the day, that's his prerogative. But that's why we sit here 2 years later and he's on the cusp of getting the franchise tag as a result.
Well, and I would think maybe they shorten the term. Maybe it's a 4-year deal. That way he hits some market at 29 or 30. But I do think if he has appetite to remain with the Baltimore Ravens, I think it's up to him, not to the team, to put this thing together. I think they've made him good offers, solid offers, market value offers, whatever you want to call them. But I still go back to his appetite, what he wants to do. And he's a different kind of a cat. We've seen that from day one. There's elements about it that we love him, and there's elements that, that we don't, such as him having a conventional agent. So that way this thing could have been put to bed a long time ago.
Yeah. And one thing you said, we don't know what the exact offer looks like that the Baltimore Ravens have made. We don't know that. So let's be fair about that.
Sure.
However, when you look at the guarantees that were built into Mark Andrews' deal, relative to other tight ends, you look at what they just did with Roquan Smith, you look at where Ronnie Stanley and Marlon Humphrey's deals were at that point in time related to the cornerback and offensive tackle markets. The Ravens aren't cheap. Look, they're not cheap.
And I like what DeCosta's done. He tends to he doesn't kick the can down the road like Ozzie used to do with restructures and whatnot. So they have a very healthy balance sheet. They have they don't have
as you go.
Yeah, they don't have as pay as you go, as you said correctly, and they don't have a lot of dead cap money that a lot of teams are saddled with. That's why they're competitive every year. It's part of the big reason why they're competitive, and I think that's something that a lot of our fans miss about this team.
Well, and look, and to be clear, that doesn't mean it's perfect. That doesn't mean there aren't things they could do better.
Of
You and I
course.
talked about this 2 years ago was when I would have been more aggressive to try to really max out the value of the Lamar
Absolutely.
Jackson
Absolutely.
quarterback contract.
Yeah.
They didn't.
They missed the
So
window. They did.
yeah, they did. And we talked about wide receiver and other things they did at alternative to that. So look, that's part of it. It's not me saying the Ravens are perfect. They're not. I don't think they're perfect at all. I think there are definitely things they can do better, including needing to revamp their strength program. They just fired their strength coach, and look at the NFLPA's report card. They got an F minus. That shows how bad it was. And that
reminds me of my report card back at Eastern Tech back in the day. My gosh,
yeah,
I had nightmares about that. But yeah, you're right about that.
and that's on John Harbaugh and the organization. Steve
It
Saunders
is.
probably should have been canned 2 years ago
Yeah.
if it was that
There's
toxic.
They're loyal
Again,
people, though. They're loyal people. They're slow to move, right?
yeah,
That's the word on the street about them.
sure.
They're loyal to a fault. We've seen that with John Harbaugh. He's loyal to a fault because he's a good man, and that's what good people do.
So I mean that we can find middle ground here between, hey, the Ravens could do this better, they could do that better, but also
Sure.
realizing they're not the worst organization in the NFL.
Far from it. Far
I mean,
from it. They're in the upper echelon, and
exactly.
the
So
vocal minority that from the Ravens Twitter fan base. That's not they don't represent the views of the majority of us season ticket holders. That's for sure.
no question. But I will say this, and this will be our final point. They are at a significant, major inflection point here with Lamar Jackson. However they proceed, whether it's working out a deal or maybe they give in at some point in time or he gives in, whether it is playing on the tag for 2023 and we're talking about the same thing next year. Lord, I hope not. I hope not, for my sanity, if nothing else, for selfish reasons, or we are talking about a trade and understanding what that means. This is a major inflection point for this organization. They need to get this right because if they don't, and you could talk about this, they can get 5 first-round picks, but we've talked about it. You draft the next Kyle Bowler,
Zach Wilson, right?
Zach Wilson.
I love C.J. Stroud, but again, it's not a guarantee. You got about a 33% chance of hitting on that first-round quarterback. 33%, not 66 or 67. So the odds are you're not going to hit on that quarterback. It's just simple.
And even if it's 50-50, even if let's say, okay, quarterbacks seem to be, you're seeing more quarterbacks ready to play sooner than later compared to what you used to see. They hit on Lamar Jackson. They hit on Joe Flacco. Are they going to go 3 for 3 with that? And look, there's skill involved there. You have to, there's skill. It's not random, but there is a lot of unknown
100%.
that goes into that. And that's why I've said to Nestor over and over, it's real easy to be frustrated and just say you're done with them, but trading away your franchise quarterback, difficult as that feels like it is, that's a heck of a lot easier than replacing your franchise quarterback. So that is a cautionary tale to tread carefully. And the Ravens, however this works out, they better get it right because, as I mentioned, everything we just said in complimenting the organization, that can start to turn very quickly if you don't have your quarterback, as Eric DeCosta acknowledged as much in Indy at the Combine.
We've said this before, Luke, ad nauseum. If you're a GM and a head coach, you select the right quarterback, you're in the Hall of Fame. You select the wrong quarterback, you're unemployed or doing broadcasts on TV like Brian Billick did. Brian always joked about that. So you're tying your fortune to a Hall of Fame or a Hall of very good quarterback if you're going to be around for a while. I mean, if Lamar Jackson didn't if Harbaugh didn't if Joe Flacco didn't get hurt, maybe John Harbaugh would have been looking for a job after that season. So a lot of gratitude on that part. So Luke, I appreciate your time as always. Please tell our listeners all the great stuff you do for the Baltimore Positive, WNST, as well as your great all the great stuff you do on Twitter, your social media presence, your blog, etc.
I appreciate that, Dennis. I encourage everyone to follow us on Twitter at WNST. You can follow me personally at Baltimore Luke. Check out my blog at baltimorepositive.com. The latest on Eric DeCosta's comments, talking a little bit about the rest of the roster and the holding pattern that we'd mentioned, and Calais Campbell and Marcus Peters and all of that. Check that out at baltimorepositive.com. My blog, sponsored by Coons Baltimore Ford. You want to be on the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford Baltimore. The latest on the Ravens, Lamar Jackson getting the franchise tag. Could there be a trade at some point? Could there be a long-term contract signing at some point? Who knows? But you'll get it first via the WNST Baltimore Positive Text Service, sponsored by Coons Ford Baltimore, which sends out any significant local sports news directly to your mobile device. You want to be, and of course, anything throughout the week on AM 1570 with Nestor. Any Ravens sound from the Combine upcoming press conferences as we get into free agent season and signings or potential trades, anything of that nature. And of course, down the pike, we're about less than a month away from opening day now for the Orioles. Plenty of sound from the ballpark as we get the season underway. All of that at BaltimorePositive.com.
All right, my friend. Always a pleasure having you on. And well, there'll be some movement next week, right? One way or another, it's coming.
We know there will be a tag. Well, we assume there will be a tag. We will know which tag. And then at that point, we'll be able to proceed as far as how the Ravens are going to get under the cap. What are they going to do? And then how much space can they create? There are always ways to do it, but there are consequences to in how you do that. So it will be very interesting to see how it plays out. But I assume we'll talk a little bit about Lamar Jackson next week, one way or the other. That's a pretty good bet.
I think it's a very astute assumption. Luke, appreciate you. Keep doing great things, my friend.
Thanks, Dennis. Be well. I appreciate you.
There you go. There you go. Is Luke Jones here, 1570 AM WNST. We'll take a quick break and come back right after this.